Good evening and welcome to the 29th talk in this series of Fireside Twilight Great Mind Talks. Call it what you will, and the aim is simply to give people stimulation, enjoyment, better understanding of history, philosophy, economic science, whatever it is. The series covers everything. If you're new to this series, a very warm welcome and thank you for joining. And if you would like to have questions, please type them in the usual way. If you enjoy tonight and want to circulate the detail to friends, please do. Every university tries to reach out to its local environment. The University of Buckingham, exactly the same. It's just a lovely thing to be able to do. Now tonight we have somebody I first met 30 years ago when he was working on the Financial Times and the Observer, and then he next came to prominence as the head of policy for Tony Blair. I remember Andrew saying at that time you couldn't totally see where you finished and where Tony Blair began. You then became a cabinet minister, having been the top special advisor, political aide in the country, and Secretary of State for Transport, House of Lords. You then had views on the European Union and on that debate. Next week, by the way, we have Jo Cox's sister talking about Jo. I'll talk about that at the end of the talk. And tonight we're going to be talking about arguably the greatest foreign secretary of all time, in arguably the greatest peacetime premiership of 300 years of premiership, that of Clement Attlee. That's certainly been argued recently in a book that this was the greatest administration since 1721, the first government. And tonight we have, by the way, I'm just looking at the numbers here, Andrew had 550 when you interviewed Tony Blair, and we have so far, listening to us, we have over 900. And that's 900 different sets watching, and there'll often be 2 or 3 people watching each set. So let's conservatively put that at 1,500. That means you have 3 times more people looking at this, Andrew, than the person you're writing your next book about, Tony Blair. More on that later. Let's get straight on to this talk. And Andrew's going to show us some slides during it. Do have questions, do communicate. I'll try and pick up all the questions I can. Andrew, it's a real thrill to have you here talking to us. Thank you.
And Anthony, it's a huge pleasure to be joining you and all the viewers and listeners. I love doing these podcasts, and the reason I was writing about Ernie Bevin, and the book has appeared 2 weeks ago for the 75th anniversary of the 1945 election. Indeed, we're in that twilight period between the election being held, which was on the 5th of July, 1945, and the results being declared, which was on the 27th of July, which was because of the extra 3 weeks given for service people to vote. So at this stage in 1945, people didn't know what the result was, and there were thousands of ballot boxes sealed in the basements of town halls up and down the country. But it was a great government, and to my mind, the second biggest figure in it, after Clement Attlee, was Ernie Bevin. And the reason I wrote this book was because I wanted to read about Ernie Bevin, because I was actually, in the throes of the big Brexit campaigns that we've been having over the last few years, it became clear to me that understanding the legacy of the 1945 government was absolutely vital to understanding our relations with Europe since and the situation we're in now. And as so often in politics and in life, the situation pulls both ways. So the 1945 Labour government was profoundly influential in creating democracy in Western Europe. Ernie Bevin almost single-handedly began the process which led to the creation of the state the Federal Republic of Germany, the democratic state of West Germany, and by bringing Britain with the United States solidly in support of West Berlin and relieving what was effectively a siege of West Berlin by Stalin between 1948 and 1949, he basically kept Stalin and Soviet Russia out of Western Europe and maintained Berlin as an international Western capital, as well as the meeting place with the Soviet bloc. And when I came to want to read about this, I found there was no modern biography of Ernie Bevin, who was the key figure. Nor was there a biography of him which looked at the other side of the coin, which is why Britain didn't join the European Coal and Steel Community in 1950, which was an absolutely seminal moment also in the construction of both Europe after 1945 and also Britain's relationship with it, because it's our failure to go into the European Coal and Steel Community, which becomes the common market, which becomes the European Union, which led to us being half in and half out, which has been our position ever since. So that's the reason why I wrote the book. And there's nobody I would rather be discussing it with than Anthony Selden, because Anthony is the biographer of all prime ministers since John Major. And indeed, I think I'm right in saying, Anthony, your first book was on Winston Churchill's second term, his 1951 to 55. Didn't you call it Indian Summer? I think that's what it was called.
I did, Andrew.
So you've actually got a view all the way through. And what I was looking at in the book, which again is a book I wanted to read, so, and there not being one, I decided to write it, was not only Ernie Bevin's amazing life and the account of those two extraordinary governments that he was the pillar of, the 1940 coalition government with Churchill, which Labour was an absolute central part of, and the 1945 Attlee government, but also his legacy. So that's how the book came to be written. And what I was going to do now was, because the book is, as I always like history books to be, is fully illustrated. It's got 60 pictures and the same number of cartoons. I think cartoons are hugely important to understanding politics in the modern age, how cartoonists see characters, what they say about them, the images they create are hugely influential and also very representative of how these characters are seen more widely. And I thought I would share as a way of linking themes I was going to set up for you in the next 20 minutes or so. I would share 10 photos and cartoons with you. And Matt, who's brilliant at the technical side of this operation, is going to put them up one by one, and then I'll talk to them. And I hope by the end you'll get a view of this amazing character, Ernie Bevin, who starts out as the illegitimate son of a single mother in deep rural West Somerset in the agricultural depression of the 1880s. As one of his neighbours said, their neighbours said, no one was born poorer in the world than Ernie Bevin and his mum. And she then dies when he's 8. He's passed around a number of relations. He leaves school at 11, barely able to read and write, no secondary education at all. Becomes a farm boy at sixpence a week, working 10, 12 hours a day, which he called a form of slavery. He wasn't sentimental about it at all. And is so desperate to escape from this that he literally walks out of his farm after a fight with his farmer who tries to thrash him for not picking enough turnips. And he leaves and walks to Bristol, which is the big port city of the southwest, with nothing other than the clothes on his back and the address 2 older brothers, one of whom works in a butcher's shop and the other who works in a cafe. And that is how it starts. And this guy comes to found the biggest trade union in the country, becomes Minister of Labour at Churchill's right hand during the war, Foreign Secretary in the post-war Labour government, and arguably, but for Churchill and Attlee, the most significant politician in this crucial decade of the 1940s. So that's the story. And it really starts, the reason the book is called Ernest Bevin, Labour's Churchill, is because there's a lot of similarities between Bevin and Churchill. And if we could have the first slide, Matt, which is one of the most... no, the first slide is all behind you, Winston. That's the one. Yep, the first slide. This is one of the most important and famous cartoons of the 20th century. This is David Lowe, the brilliant cartoonist of the war years. And this cartoon appears on the 12th of May 1940, which is the day that Winston Churchill's coalition government is formed after Neville Chamberlain is brought down in the House of Commons at the beginning of May. 1940. It's a coalition government, whereas Chamberlain's government had just been a Tory government. And the two key Labour figures in government are Ernie Bevin and Clem Attlee. And there you have it in the front row of this cartoon. You have Winston Churchill, sleeves rolled up, all behind you, Winston, with an almost identical Ernie Bevin, similarly huge hulk of a man, totally determined, larger than life, sleeves rolled up in the front, with an emaciated Clem Attlee in between them. You also might notice Neville Chamberlain directly behind Churchill, Herbert Morrison slightly to the left and behind Bevin and other characters in there. And that symbolised the unity not just of the government, coalition government, but of the nation at this crucial moment when Britain was about to be invaded by Hitler, symbolised the determination to stand up, Britain, to be patriots, not to do what France had done and succumb to defeatism and a negotiated peace, and see this through. And so you have those figures at the front, and then you have the whole of the nation. This is what's so brilliant about the cartoon, is that as the rows go back, the figures become more and more anonymous, and you've got this vision of the whole nation behind Churchill and Attlee and Bevin, which is roughly what the position was in May 1940, particularly after these two great bulldog characters, Churchill and Bevin, take charge. Now, when Churchill forms his coalition government in 1940, Attlee is the leader of the Labour Party, and plays an absolutely crucial part in putting Churchill in office and in making that whole government a success. But so far as the public's concerned, the biggest second figure in the government was Ernie Bevin. Churchill himself said, the Labour man I most wanted, Ernie Bevin, who'd been the transformational leader of the Transport and General Workers Union for the last 20 years, effectively the leader of the organised working class. He also saw him as a brilliant organiser, and he knew that at first hand, because in the general strike of 1926, just 14 years before these great events of 1940, Bevin had, to all intents and purposes, been the brains behind the union side, and Churchill had been the brains behind the government side, government headed by Stanley Baldwin. So they had a very wary respect for each other, which went back 15 years before 1940. And it was that respect which turned into admiration in the 1930s, because both Churchill and Bevin spoke out really strongly against appeasement in the 1930s. Indeed, in many ways, Bevin was stronger against appeasement than was Churchill, because whereas Churchill was brilliant at standing up against Hitler, after Hitler comes to power in 1933, Bevin had started calling time on the fascist dictators. Back in the 1920s, when Mussolini takes over in Italy, whereas Churchill quite likes Mussolini, he visits him in Italy, in Rome, and thinks he's a great guy, which is never the position with Bevin. Bevin never falls personally for dictators. He's never impressed by the charisma of others, including Churchill himself, although he hugely respected him and worked at his right hand in the war, never fell into believing that he was a superhuman figure. And he didn't think that of either the fascist dictators of the right, nor, crucially, after 1945, did Ernie Bevin think of it in respect of Stalin and the dictators of the Soviet Union. So there you have Labour's Churchill, Ernie Bevin up there with Churchill, and in the next 5 years, in what I think is the most successful government probably in British history, one that saves Britain from subjugation by Hitler and defeat in the Second World War. In that great government, Churchill commands the battlefronts and Bevin masterminds the home fronts, getting war production up, producing unity between employers and unions, which hadn't happened in the First World War, when there'd been bitter industrial strife in the country in that First World War, actually persuading people to do what appeared to be socially or politically impossible before, including effective suspension of strikes, wage agreements, which the employers had never wanted to agree before, the conscription, the industrial conscription of women, which even Churchill was against at the beginning, but Ernie Bevin carries through in 1941, the creation of a big national working class entertainment industry, which Bevin personally supervised, right to the end of the war, when the Bevin boys, who are the conscripted 1 in 10 of all male conscripts between the age of 18 and 21 at the end of the war, are sent down the mines, which is a hugely controversial step, but absolutely vital for getting coal production up, because Britain faces massive energy shortages at the end of the war. All of that, the absolute linchpin figure in mobilising the country, all of those respects, is Ernie Bevin. And in the book, I tell the story of how Bevin does command the home front while Churchill commands the battlefront. And then the book goes backwards and forwards from this big seminal moment of 1940 and saving Britain in the Second World War. And if Matt, we can have the second slide. The crucial moment when Bevin becomes a national figure and achieves national power is when he creates not just his own union, Transport and General Workers Union in 1922, but what quite quickly becomes the largest trade union in the free world. By the Second World War, the T&G, as it's known, or Bevin's Union, as it's often called, has 500,000 members. And it not only dominates the trade union movement, but it comes to represent the organised working class and is absolutely crucial in the rise of the Labour Party, with which it's allied to political power in the 1940s. And the figure who is the creator of the union and then the animator of it thereafter, right the way through to the end of the Second World War, is Ernie Bevin. Now, he begins, after he gets to Bristol, with just the addresses of his brothers and essentially a Bristol barrow boy. He gets his own horse and cart and is delivering mineral water around the city and the villages around, but then gets involved in the Bristol dock strike of 1911. That leads him into becoming an organiser for the Dockers Union, which was then, after the miners, the second largest union in the country. And he becomes a big organiser for the dockers during the war. He becomes a national celebrity after the war in 1918-19, when he leads a big court of inquiry into dockers' wages, which is in the Royal Courts of Justice in the Strand. He comes to be called the Dockers KC because he does an 11-hour presentation of Dockers' case, which wins and gets them a massive pay rise. And it's out of the back of that that he persuades 14 unions, of which the dockers are the biggest. There are lots of others in the transport sector and lots of trades, including what were called carters, which is what Bevin had been, drivers of horse-drawn carriages and trucks, brings them all together in this amalgamated union, the Transport and General Workers Union. And it's between 1920 and 1922 that he does it. And there you see in front of you the big poster that Bevin sends around, which is part of his hearts and minds job. He travels around the entire country, getting these hundreds of different branches of the Dockers Union and other 13 unions to vote for this amalgamation. And he makes the case for it that unity is strength, all of the classic arguments of working class organisations, indeed the classic argument of communist organisation of the period. And Clem Attlee's alter ego, who came to be a spokesman after 1955, a man called Francis Williams, in the first biography of Ernie Bevin, he says that in 1918 to the early 1920s, Ernie Bevin was a kind of Stalinist figure in British public life. He was a hugely active and a brilliant organiser of the working class, who had the capacity to exploit massive industrial unrest in the way that in Russia had led to the Russian Revolution, but in Britain doesn't. And part of his explanation of why it doesn't is that though Ernie Bevin has all of the organisational skills and much of the sheer brute force of Joseph Stalin, he's a democrat, is not a dictator. And that's the fundamental difference between them. And I think that is hugely important in explaining Britain's transition to democracy in the interwar period. If we can move on to the third slide, the seminal moment when the unions take a democratic course rather than a revolutionary course is the general strike of 1926. Now, Bevin hadn't wanted the general strike. He had only just become a big figure in the TUC. His own union, the Transport and General Workers Union, had only just been formed. The reason why the general strike happens in 1926 is because the union movement until Bevin was dominated by the miners, and the miners are by the mid-1920s, like many trade unions across Europe, the miners are under communist control. Their general secretary is a guy who's an out-and-out communist who describes himself as a loyal servant of Lenin, and he wants a general strike to bring down the government. Now, of course, the conditions in the mining industry were terrible. Big wage cuts are taking place, and there's an appalling situation in mines, which then employ directly or indirectly nearly 1 million people. You know, thousands being killed each year, terrible working conditions, really bitter strife between employers and the unions. But what Bevin wanted to do was to negotiate for a better deal, whereas what A.J. Cook wants to do, who's the communist leader of the miners, think Arthur Scargill in the 1980s, very similar type characters, is he wants a general strike to bring down the government. And when it comes to the general strike, Bevin is last in, first out. He doesn't want the general strike. He tries to bring about a negotiation before. When he fails to persuade the miners to accept it, and there's a kind of stampede towards the strike, he goes along with it and is the best organizer during the strike. But after 9 days, he persuades the TUC General Council that the situation is becoming semi-revolutionary, that now that Stanley Baldwin has made it a matter of constitution against the unions, there's no way the unions can win this. And he persuades them to call off the strike. Which is a seminal moment in the development of British labourism and British trade union movements, that the trade union movement takes a constitutional course, seeking in a very hard-headed and aggressive way, but nonetheless a constitutional way to negotiate for better terms and conditions. It takes a Bevinist course. It doesn't take a communist course. And the British Worker that you can see there, which is the union newspaper, published in each of the 9 days of the general strike, headed out rather ironically, all's well. In fact, when that was published, this is in the second week of the strike, all was not well. I mean, the whole thing was on the verge of unraveling. See the reference to Churchill's stunt on the right? Churchill edited the government newspaper during the 9 days, which Stanley Baldwin deliberately put him on because he didn't want him in charge of troops doing anything that might actually lead to a civil war. But you have these two great characters, Bevin and Churchill, who are fighting by proxy, essentially, the general strike. And it's a defining moment for both of them. But what Bevin, if we can move on to the third slide, what Bevin never gives up on is the campaign to tackle mass unemployment, which is what had been one of the big factors behind the general strike of 1926 and comes to be the scourge of the British working class in the late 1920s and 1930s, as unemployment rockets from 1 million in 1929 to an unprecedented 3 million by 1931, and remains a chronic problem in the 1920s. Now, Bevin, I said earlier, left school at 11 and never had a proper secondary education. But in classic working class style of the age, he was an autodidact. He read books voraciously. He went to night school when he was a drayman in Bristol and did extension classes. And in the late 20s, when he becomes a big trade union figure, he forms a very unlikely friendship, which I explain in the book, with John Maynard Keynes, maybe the greatest economist ever in the history of the world, maybe second after Adam Smith, but an absolutely seminal figure. And in the period between 1929 and 1932, Keynes and Bevin, the Bristol Barrow boy and the Etonian fellow of King's College, Cambridge, and aesthete extraordinaire, chairman of the Royal Opera House and all of that, they form one of the most unlikely and brilliant partnerships between them, where Keynes makes intellectual arguments for what becomes known as Keynesianism, which is the state taking a big role and investing in oppression to create jobs rather than tolerating mass unemployment. And Bevin, the Bristol Barrow boy who becomes the biggest trade union leader in the country, seizes on these ideas and turns them into big practical schemes. And this is just one example of Bevin out there with his plan, what should actually happen to tackle unemployment. But quite quickly, by the mid-1930s, if we can move on to the fifth slide, which is a famous cartoon of 1933, Hitler and Mussolini, after Hitler seizes power in 1933, quite quickly, Bevin is, as well as being a big leader of the working class, also becomes a siren voice against the rise of the dictators in Europe and the need to stand up to them. One of the biggest contributions that Bevin makes to the Labour Party in the 1930s, and this is told in my chapter on the rise of Clem Attlee, is that Ernie Bevin gets out in 1935. He evicts a guy called George Lansbury, who was the Jeremy Corbyn lookalike leader of the Labour Party in the early to mid-1930s, who had been a pacifist, was in favour of peace at any price, and didn't believe either in rearmament or the use of force to stand up to the dictators. This leads to a big crisis in 1935 at the Labour Party conference, when the big issue is whether Britain will support the League of Nations in using military force to prevent Mussolini invading Ethiopia, which is the first big breach of national boundaries, which takes place in the 30s and leads ultimately to Munich and the invasion of Poland in 1939. And Bevin is absolutely resolute about the need to stand up to the dictators. And first he gets rid of George Lansbury as leader of the Labour Party and puts in, effectively, Clem Attlee, who over time becomes in favour of rearmament. But also he bitterly attacks Stanley Baldwin, who refuses himself to send troops to prevent Ethiopia being invaded. If we can move on to the sixth slide, once the war starts, Ernie Bevin becomes Labour's Churchill. His job is Minister of Labour to motivate the population at large, get industrial production. And this is one of hundreds of cartoons about Ernie Bevin in those war years, essentially leading a massive national movement to maintain a united home front with the highest level of production possible. It was said in the war that Britain has more of its population engaged in war production than either fascist Italy or Germany. And that was largely due to Ernie Bevin. And here you have a characteristic cartoon of the day, lots of middle-class ladies with their hats and all of that, being encouraged by Bevin to turn themselves into factory workers and put on the overalls. Once more unto the breaches, dear friends, you can see the words of Ernie Bevin, and that's very characteristic. After 1945, he takes exactly the same, we're now on to slide 7, exactly the same British John Bull bulldog approach to dealing with the new Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin. And on his first day as Foreign Secretary, he and Clem Attlee go to Potsdam, because the Potsdam Conference is in full swing when the government changes in Britain, and Attlee replaces Churchill at the end of July. And within an hour of arriving in Potsdam, their plane touching down, Attlee and Bevin go into conference plenary session with Stalin and President Truman, who has replaced Harry Truman, who's replaced Roosevelt, who died a month before. And here is a characteristic cartoon, and it works at so many different levels. The British John Bull, Clem Attlee, who famously said, because he didn't speak much in these sessions, no point having a dog if you're going to bark yourself, setting off Ernie against Stalin in the conference. And the effete aristocrats from the Foreign Office behind, can you see, it says behind in the on that briefcase they're carrying, Bevin boys of the Foreign Office, all these effete aristocrats, with that wonderful quote at the top, "Go easy, Ernie. Remember, Joe is used to dealing with aristocrats and he mightn't understand our work." Now, what actually happens in that first session of the Potsdam Conference, and you can see it in the next picture, we're now on to the next picture, please, Matt, which is a photo, a really dramatic photo of that meeting, that first meeting of the big three and their foreign ministers in Potsdam, is Stalin holding court the great charismatic dictator, even marked out in his dress with his Marshal of the Soviet Union white tunic, with Luk Molotov next to him, his foreign minister, fawning next to him, everyone else either looking down at the next man, and Ernie Bevin directly opposite him next to Attlee. Bevin starts shouting at him in this meeting about how he will not allow the Soviet Union and Russia to start dismantling West German industry and repeating all the mistakes of 1918 with the reparations on Germany, and asking for full particulars what it is the Russians are intending to do, and saying that Britain won't agree to the new borders of Poland. Stalin has never had anyone who stood up to him like this before. Of course, he's abolished all his trade unions in Russia. And day after, the following day, Stalin goes down with a quote-unquote cold. And as one of the greatest historians of the Cold War says, this is an anti-Bevin chill, which he developed. He didn't want to go into another plenary session with Ernie Bevin. What he wanted to do instead was to do bilateral deals with Harry Truman, who's at the far right of the photo, putting on his glasses. Because at that stage, Truman was seeking to appease Stalin and was trying to split the difference between the Brits and the Russians. And what Ernie Bevin did so brilliantly in the first 2 years of that government, before Truman himself comes into the Bevin position on being anti-communist and anti-Russian, is what Bevin does is to hold the line against a separate US deal with Russia that could easily have happened, and which could have sold out West Germany and led to it becoming a neutral and demilitarized state. And if we can move on to slide 9, by 1949, arguably Bevin's greatest success of his career, which is the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany, this democratic state of West Germany, built out of what were the British and the American zones. The British zone of West Germany, which is the Ruhr and the Rhine, the industrial heartland, which he has successfully kept Russia out of, and the American zone, which is what's now called Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria. Those are put together in the British zone, and in 1949 they formed the bedrock with West Berlin of the Federal Republic of Germany, which of course comes to be the bedrock of West European prosperity and democracy in the decades after 1949. In some ways, of course, comes to eclipse Britain itself, but which hadn't been foreseen at all in 1946, 47, 48, when Bevin is negotiating it. Here is an absolutely brilliant cartoon of Uncle Ernie, or Auntie Ernie, as he's portrayed there, next to Robert Schuman on the right, the French Prime Minister, and George Marshall, the American Secretary of State, in the middle. And out of the pram, Allied occupation, is this youthful but already fairly beefy West Germany, which of course becomes the powerhouse of Europe in the 1950s and 60s. And I argue in my book, the single most important legacy of Ernest Bevin is a free and democratic and powerful and prosperous West Germany, which very few foresaw in the mid-1940s. Comes to be not only the bedrock of Western Europe, but in many ways, the bedrock of the West. As we look at it back in 2020, if you had to say who is the more reliable champion of Western values now in 2020, is it the United States or even Boris Johnson's Britain, or is it Angela Merkel's Germany? Of course, Germany became united in 1990 by essentially the expansion of West Germany into East Germany. I think there are many people, myself included, who would say it's Germany. But finally, it's not all plain sailing. Ernie Bevin is an imperialist, and I argue in the book that Ernie's greatest mistakes in the late 1940s come from the fact that another facet of him being Labour's Churchill is that he's a pretty unreconstructed imperialist too. This is the British passports that were issued. We're all into passports now, aren't we? These are the passports issued in the late 1940s, and they're very remarkable because Ernie Bevin is the last foreign secretary who issues passports in his own name. Because, of course, before the Second World War, very few people had had passports. Passports only come to be mass commodities in the 1950s. When they do become mass commodities, they stop being printed in the name of the foreign secretary. Ernie Bevin is there as the last foreign secretary who issues passports where the first page of the passport begins with the famous words, "We, Ernest Bevin, a member of His Britannic Majesty's Most Honourable Privy Council, Member of Parliament, etc., His Majesty's Principal Secretary State for Foreign Affairs, request and require in the name of His Majesty. To all those to whom it may concern, and so on. And the reason why it's so symbolic is that's very much how Ernie thought of Britain's position in the world and his position as British Foreign Secretary. He was, I think, the last Foreign Secretary who, except possibly for Anthony Eden in the early to mid-1940s, who really thought that the British Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs could request and require other countries to do what they wanted. And the upside of that, I believe, is that that is part of what gave him a huge self-confidence and self-belief to stand up to Stalin. The downside of it is that it led to overextension in many of Britain's imperial commitments after 1945. It led to the failure to found the State of Israel, which Britain fails to do in 1947 because it's so imperialist-minded, with a streak of anti-Semitism, alas, Ernie Bevin's makeup, which leads Britain literally to abandon Palestine rather than create a State of Israel, which creates so many of the problems we have thereafter. And it also, if I can move on to the final slide, leads to what I think, but others may disagree, is a mistake of that Labour government, which is when France and West Germany moved to create the European Coal and Steel Community in 1950, which becomes Common Market and then the European Union, Ernie Bevin stands apart from it. He stands apart from it because he says the Durham miners won't wear it, but also he doesn't actually want to cooperate as an equal with his new creation, West Germany and the French. He still believes Britain is an empire which can be above Europe and not a partner within it. So the biography warts and all, it's an amazing story. I don't believe you can understand modern Britain, let alone 1940s Britain, without understanding Ernie Bevin. And whether you agree or disagree with my interpretation, I hope on reading the book, you'll see Ernie as a larger-than-life human being, one in a million, as he put it himself, who in that respect, as well as the others, was Labour's Churchill.
Thank you, Andrew, very, very much indeed. A wonderful talk and really illuminated by those slides that get us right back, and thank you for that. I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to leap, just as a stimulus and a reminder to everyone to ask questions. That the first question came in at 6. You've only been talking for 2 minutes, and the first question came in and said, Andrew, thank you for your talk. I had no idea how he knew it's going to be a good talk, but obviously he did. He said you refer to him as Bevin up to page 86, and suddenly you start referring to him as Ernie. Does that indicate a certain fondness for him as you came to know him through your research, Andrew? Did you know that you'd done that?
There may be a subliminally, that may be partly true, but there's another reason why I do it, which is that when he's a young man and making his way, he's always known as Bevin. Once he becomes a national celebrity, a bit like Boris, everyone starts referring to him as Ernie. It's very, very striking. There's a famous exchange in the House of Commons when he's Minister of Labour, when he says, and when the Prime Minister, Churchill, when the Prime Minister and I went to see the troops embarking the Normandy, he said, they said to me, Ernie, we're doing this for you, but we want a better peace afterwards. And an MP, because there's nothing the House of Commons likes than deflating big egos, and it has to be said, Ernest Bevin had a huge ego. An MP interrupts and said, they're doing it for you, Ernie. And Bevin, with great presence of mind, says, yes, I know all these people because they're my union members and they call me Ernie. And he silences the critic, which is very unusual in the House of Commons in a situation like that. So he had this quality which not many people have. Boris Johnson's got it. I'm trying to think of others who've had it in the last generation. A bit of Maggie, but not much. That was her kind of media nickname, but the public at large didn't really call her Maggie Thatcher. But Ernest Bevin was generally known in the TNG and in the public media and on the street. When he was out on the street, people would shout out, Ernie, good on you, and so on. That is what he was called. That makes him very unusual.
But that point there about, is it important, Andrew, for a biographer, coming up of your biography of Tony, official, authorised Tony Blair biography. Is it important that you like and get to know the person, and also how has it helped you writing about Bevin that you walked the same corridors in Downing Street, were in the same rooms, knew the Foreign Office very well, knew Parliament, you were a member of the House of Lords. His earlier biographer was Alan Bullock, who then went on to write a biography of Hitler and Stalin. Presumably he didn't like him, but how, that's two questions there, Andrew. Is it important to like the person you're writing about? And secondly, has it helped you that, unlike earlier writers of many famous people in the 20th century, political figures, you've actually been there and done it, you know what it's like?
I would answer yes to both of those. Yes, it is important to like the person you're writing about. It'd be very hard, because you basically, when you're writing a biography, this is the first full-length biography I've written, but you've done many, Anthony, so you know the sensation. You essentially move in with your subject, don't you? I mean, you live and breathe them. There isn't a day when you don't think about them. You probably know them better than anybody, maybe, than their spouse or lover. I mean, you really, really get to know them well. I couldn't imagine being closeted with somebody who I positively disliked for longer than a year. And that was very important in respect to Bevin, that I liked him. I saw his faults and some aspects of his character I didn't like at all, particularly the anti-Semitism. But I did basically admire him, and I thought he was a really extraordinary human being. It did help also that I live and work in Westminster, and I saw all that. And it definitely would have helped my biography if I'd myself in my earlier life been a trade union organiser and understood that side of life. And if I'm being completely self-critical about it, I think I've done a really good job of him as Foreign Secretary. I understand, I've been in, I know the Foreign Office, I've been in all these embassies and all that. I have a great sense of the life that he led. Whereas I think Alan Bullock, who began his life as an industrial relations historian, I think he had a better empathy for Bevin, the trade union leader. And I think the ideal biographer of Ernie Bevin is probably a compound of me, Alan Bullock, and Alan Johnson. But alas, you can only have one at a time.
Next question to come up, and do, by the way, on questions, you do put your name if you want to. Most are anonymous at the moment. Andrew, do you see any of yourself in Bevin? And is he someone you'd like to have worked with?
Yes, I do, is the answer. I empathised with Ernie Bevin in a number of respects. My own background isn't completely dissimilar from him in terms of family background, not having much to start with and so on. And I empathised with him that in that way. I was very lucky. I was of the generation who you could make it up from with little to start with through university. Ernie would have loved to have gone to university. He never was one of those people who looked down on education. He loved the private schools. He loved the fact that he'd spoken at Eton and Harrow. So he had no reverse snobbery about him at all. I was very lucky I did the university course. I sympathised with that element of him. I also, my own political life has been spent trying to construct big institutions that last. And Ernie said, brothers, we're going to build. In the language of today, he was Boris Johnson's build, build, build. That's what he did. Ernie hated opposition. He loved government. He hated tilting at windmills. He always wanted to be making things work, negotiating pay deals, creating institutions, creating industrial institutions, which he did a lot of, creating big political institutions, West German state, NATO. You can go through the list of Bevinist institutions that he created, and I completely sympathise with that. The people who pass on legacies in history are those who create institutions, and few have created more institutions than Bevin.
His own private life, Andrew, I know very little about it. His love life, his health. I mean, he was a big man. We saw him with a cigarette in that photograph you showed us at Potsdam. Was he very unhealthy? And tell us about his death. Or also, did that lack of health contribute to his relatively premature death? 70-ish?
Well, one of my criticisms of the Alan Bullock biography, which I think is sometimes an issue with academic biographies, is they don't do enough on the personal life. There are only a handful of references in this 2,500 pages of Alan Bullock to Florence, Ernie's wife, and almost no references at all to his daughter, Queenie. And so I set out to find out a lot more about them. And Flo is the daughter of a Bristol wine taster, who's also a young Bristol Fabian and socialist. And they fall in love when he's in his early 20s, long-time girlfriend, and then they marry when he's in his mid-20s, and they stay together all the way through, right the way through to Ernie's death. I couldn't find any reference at all to any affairs, which I may say is quite unusual for public figures in the whole of his life. It may be that the records have been destroyed, but I don't think that they existed, because what's very clear to me all the way through is that they were very close. They used to go to the music hall every Saturday evening. Even though Ernie was a workaholic, he did have regard to family life. They had a semi-detached in Golders Green, which they moved into in the mid-1920s when the Northern Line was extended to Golders Green with fields at the back, and Queenie, known as Q, their daughter, went to a girls' secondary school in North London, one of the first generation of girls to go to secondary education. They had a big yellow Talbot Dark, which they used to drive out to because Ernie loved driving out into the countryside at weekends. They went to the Regent's Park horse trials because they had this love of horses from his time as a trainman. And when he's foreign secretary and he does these big international conferences, including going on Queen Mary to the United States for months at a time, negotiating post-war peace treaties, he always takes Flo with him. And the day he dies in 1951, in the Foreign Secretary's residence in 1 Carlton Gardens, he had a really serious heart condition. He's been very unwell for the 2 years running up to it. He couldn't go. They were due to be going to Wembley to see the football. He couldn't go because he's so unwell. And one of his best friends takes Flo to Wembley, and they come back in the afternoon and they find Ernie propped up in bed in a really heart-rending picture that is in my mind as we speak, of Ernie Bevin propped up in his bed with his red ministerial box to one side, papers all scattered around, with him slumped forward, having had a massive heart attack, and the key to the red box grasped vice-like in his hand. And that is, to me, the great image of Ernie Bevin dying in service. A workaholic to the end who just wouldn't give up on life and on duty. He dies with his official papers in bed with the red box, with the key to the red box, which has to be prized out of his hand.
Very moving. And of course, you're right about the need to have a 360 biography, and not all politicians have been unfaithful. Many are faithful, but whatever their life, it's important to talk about that because it clearly makes them who they are. A question there about Andrew, how come somebody with so much disadvantage, economic, social, but then losing parent at the age, was it 7, his mother? I mean, that would have broken so many people. What is it? Where does this self-belief, energy, life force come from?
Well, he's clearly a brilliant organizer. That's the thing that comes through time and again in Ernie's career. He's a brilliant organizer. And that begins when he arrives in Bristol. He organizes his life, gets it together, job after job. He negotiates a better deal for himself. Part of the reason he becomes a drayman is because he's then self-employed effectively and is on commission. And so he can support his family, get married, and so on. And then when he gets involved in the first Bristol dock strike, that's when he starts his organizational talent is applied to institutions beyond himself. And one thing leads to another. In an age, because of course there's always a lot of things that are contingent and fortuitous, in an age when trade unions become very important in British life because of the massive rise of industrial disputes and militancy and organisation during and after the First World War, which of course is also the first decade of British democracy and the rise of the Labour Party with the democratic franchise. And so this kind of Stalinist organiser meets mass trade unions, meets democracy and the Labour Party. And it's the bringing together of these strands that I think explains Bevin. And if you hadn't had the democratic franchise or hadn't had the trade unions, then Ernie's organisational talent wouldn't have led him to the top in the same way as it does after 1918.
Sometimes leaders who are outstanding organisers are doing it because they're compensating for a lack of organisation early on in their life and they feel they need to take control. But let's not go, that's just a thought. Bristol in the 20s, thinking of Peaky Blinder, not such a very different world. I mean, mass corruption and under a world going on. How does he steer clear of that? He seems not to have been tempted to enter that world.
Well, Ernie, again, interestingly, when you compare to other public figures with very long careers, isn't ever seduced by money. It's not to say he's uninterested in money. He has a perfectly good middle-class lifestyle by the 30s. Indeed, part of the book explores the difference between this image of him as the British working-class John Bull and his actual lifestyle by the 1930s, where he lives in Golders Green, has a semi-detached house, a big car, and is on a reasonable salary and so on. But he's never seduced by money, and he never wants to accumulate it. He doesn't, Ramsay MacDonald, the first Labour Prime Minister, famously says, when he betrays the Labour Party and the Labour government of 1931 and pulls it down and forms a government with the Tories, he famously says, tomorrow every duchess in England will want to kiss me, he says. Now, that kind of attitude only produces contempt from Ernie Bevin. Ernie, he wants a reasonable standard of living. He's never seduced by money and he's never seduced by status. Unusually, for a British public figure of the 20th century, he turns down all honours. Your hero, Clem Attlee, becomes a Knight of the Garter and an Earl and receives the Order of Merit and is very proud of all three, and nobody begrudges Clem Attlee any of those three. Ernie Bevin turns down all honours. He's offered the lots, peerage, knighthood, companion of honour. He turns them all down. And the reason he turns them all down is he says, I cannot be a representative of the British working class and go into council. And that's very unusual.
He's such an interesting person. Attlee, of course, was modest financially and lived in the south of the county here at Great Missenden. So they shared a certain frugality. Next question here is, what impact did Churchill's praise for Bevin in 1945 have within the Labour Party on Bevin's standing? Did that damage him because Churchill so quickly became, after the war, a polarising figure, not a unifying one?
It didn't damage him in 1945. On the contrary, one of the extraordinary things about 1945 is, of course, this massive Labour landslide, which we now take for granted historically, but astonished everybody at the time. George Orwell said it was like a bolt from the blue, this Labour landslide. And part of the reason for it, it's very clear to me, is that the leading Labour figures, Morrison, Bevin, Attlee, Cripps, who before 1939 had been seen as quasi-revolutionary figures by the English middle class, by 1945 are thoroughly reputable establishment figures. And part of the reason for that is that they've been at Churchill's right hand during that 1940 to 45 government. So far from being a disadvantage in 1945, I think it's an advantage. And the questioner mentioned, how was it seen by the working class? The crucial thing to understand is that the 1945 election is the first election since Britain became a recognisable democracy in 1918, where a majority of the English working class vote Labour. It's vital to understand all the way through the 1920s and even more so in the 1930s, the majority of the English working class vote Tory. And one of Labour's great achievements in 1945 is that for the first time, the Labour Party persuades a majority of the British Labour movement to vote for it, We now take that for granted, what happened in the post-war decade. It, in fact, was a huge cultural, social and political change in 1945. And I think it's this close relationship between the Tory elite, personified by Churchill, and the Labour elite, personified by Bevin, that makes the Labour Party safe for much of Labour Britain to vote for the first time.
Interesting. So many questions. Very briefly, next month, Andrew's 75th anniversary, 6th of August and 9th of August of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Was Bevin consulted about the dropping of those bombs? How did he get to hear about it? What did he think? And then the decision to build the British atomic bomb detonated in Montebello in October 52.
No, Britain wasn't consulted. Britain was informed very shortly before by Truman that there was this big bomb, but the details weren't. Britain wasn't consulted on, and crucially, at the end of 1945, Truman and his Secretary of State Jimmy Burns refused to share nuclear intelligence with Attlee and Bevin. This is a seminal moment in the development of British foreign policy after 1945, because it's the refusal of the Americans to share atomic research with Britain, which is absolutely crucial. Attlee and Bevin's decision a year later to proceed with a separate British nuclear weapons program. People think of it as Britain being so close to the Americans who wanted to become a nuclear power. Actually, at the time, it was as much animated by British distrust of the Americans as British alliance with the Americans.
And did he know about Burgess and Maclean and Philby? Did Bevin have his doubts about spies?
Not that I'm aware of, but of course the big spy issue is much more 1950s than 1940s.
Yeah. And during the war, was he aware of what was happening at Bletchley Park with cracking the Enigma code?
No, he wouldn't have been aware because he didn't really do the military side of the war. When I say he wasn't aware, I'm not absolutely sure because he was a member of the War Cabinet. So when I say he wasn't aware, he probably was aware that Bletchley was there. But I imagine that the War Cabinet knew that Bletchley was the decoding place, and there was certainly some of the decoded transcripts would have been relayed to the War Cabinet. But he wasn't like Churchill dealing with this material day in, day out.
And now there's a rush of questions coming in here. Just very brief answers, if possible, Andrew. Mary says, what do you think about the current state of Labour? Do you think it will take long to recover from Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, fortunately, I think I can see the Clem Attlee, who's Keir Starmer. Unfortunately, I can't see the Ernie Bevin. And we need an Ernie Bevin in the same way as we need Clem Attlee. And I can see half of the partnership at the moment, and we need the other half.
Next question here from Sarah. Do you see yourself as the new Ernie Bevin to Keir Starmer?
No. I mean, look at me. Do I look like, I'm at least 10 stone short of Ernie Bevin, and I don't have anything like force of personality, the organisational skill, and crucially also the trade. What Ernie Bevin had was he was essentially leader of the British trade union movement in a way that no one, I think, has been either before or since. And I don't know who that figure is today.
And two quick final questions. Mark says, what are you currently working on?
As of immediately, I'm doing the promotion for Ernie Bevin, and I'm doing quite a lot of parliamentary work. I attend the House of Lords every day, and I've been speaking a lot on measures to do with coronavirus. I lead a kind of double life, partly writing, but also dealing with the affairs of the day. But my next big book is going to be a biography of Tony Blair.
Of Tony Blair. And favourable or unfavourable?
I'm going to tell the truth.
We'll have you back.